Okay, so we just saw how to add animations to a paragraph, for which we also used the transition component. Now we cheated a little by using the animate.css library, so let's try to implement a custom CSS animation instead. For the interface, we used a pulse animation in the previous lecture, so let's stick to that and implement it ourselves. For that, I will add a couple of keyframes. If you are not familiar with keyframes, then this is a way to define states of an animation at various stages. It can be as simple as defining the initial and final states, or defining states at various completion percentages. Let's begin implementing the animation, as that makes it easier to both explain and to understand. So, let's add some CSS styles. I'll add a keyframe here named pulse. And I will define the initial state within the from block. And initially, I want to set a transform property and using scale 3D and set the scale to 1 initially. Then I'll define the 50% stage, at which point I'll actually just go ahead and copy this part. And I'll set the scales to 1.2 all the way across, so that the element is enlarged. And lastly, I'll add a to block, where I'll just set the scale back to 1. So we'll see that initially, the element is its normal size, then halfway through the animation, it increases in size, and then it starts to animate back to its initial size. To use these keyframes, we must define an animation for an element, in this case, the paragraph. We could specify some custom classes for that, as we saw in a previous lecture, but the easiest way is to use the default classes. We can set up the animation with the vEnterActive class. So let's go to the top of the style section and use the vEnterActive class. And use the animation CSS property and refer to the pulse keyframe and set the duration to 1 second. So this animation is using the keyframes named pulse, and the duration of the animation is 1 second. That should work, so let's see it in action. Let's click the button, and that looks good. Now that we have an entering animation, let's add a simple leaving animation. I will recreate the fade out transition that we previously implemented, but this time by using keyframes. So let's add a new keyframe and name it fade-out. And for the initial state, I'll set the opacity to 1. And I'll transition the opacity CSS property. And for the final state, I want to set the opacity to 0. So we are transitioning the opacity from 1 to 0. Note that since this animation only contains an initial and final state, it would probably be better suited as a transition, but I just wanted to show you how the same effect can be accomplished with an animation as well. To use it, we simply need to add an animation that uses the keyframe for the vLeaveActive class, similar to what we did for the entering phase. So let's go up and add a style for the v-leave-active class and use the animation CSS property with the fade out keyframe and set the duration to 1 second. And now we should see the paragraph fading out when clicking the button the second time. Awesome, so besides transitions, you now know how to use animations as well. Animations can be used for more complex effects, but can be as simple or advanced as you need.